Hello and welcome to the Synoptic Summit. My name is Trevor Erridge, and today we'll be talking about the importance of budgeting in business and how to ensure success and avoid failure. We'll also be looking at why budgeting within your organization is critical and why it's the only way to ensure success, how to use your budgets to improve accelerated growth and to ensure the best decisions for your organization. Let's take a look at a pretty straightforward statement here, and that is that far too many companies suffer from the exercise of building a budget with results that yield some major flaws. Number one is that the budget exercise takes too long to complete, and as a result there's little time for evaluation. Basically, it's prone to a number of errors. Often we can find that there's budgetary slack, where managers extend the expenses and reduce the revenue in order to look great. On the other hand, there's budgetary stretch, where executives may push the envelope way beyond what the company is capable of doing. Secondly, budgeting is often done in silos, so there is no related interdepartmental drivers. In other words, we take sales, they build a budget. We take production, they build a budget. We have a labor department budget. We have a materials budget. We have SG&A budget, but none of them are integrated. None of them are linked. None of them have a meaning. And so finally you end up with finance having to do a cash budget out of meaningless information. In general, that seems to be the trend. What we're looking to try and do here is have a budget solution where the things that matter, in other words, your forecast, your sales, that drives what goes on in production. Production will define what you need in terms of labor and materials. And then also it will determine your overheads, help to determine the overheads. And then the expenses obviously can be looked at independently, but they ultimately have more time to evaluate and define a level of accuracy that's better than before. Finally, when we look at budgets that are not accurate, that leads to an excuse for the variance analysis, which ultimately, from a company's perspective, has little or no meaning. So what is the importance of accurate budgeting? If for anything, let's have a look at the fact that it allows management to make informed business decisions as well as investments with the trust from the financial or lending institutions. Let's just stop there for a moment. There are very few companies that don't go out to get funding or loans from time to time from a bank. The closer you are to your projected numbers, in other words, your actuals to your budget, so much more is the chance that the banks are going to believe that what you have projected for the future or budgeted, that will be a reality or a truth. Where you've had results that have missed the mark substantially, you cannot blame financial investors to look at that very skeptically and say, well, we don't quite believe it, or put on a very strict covenants requirement for people to be able to reach those numbers, which may or may not be attainable. Accurate budgeting also provides deep insight into your spending and cash flow, especially with today's supply chain and inflationary challenges. When you look at what we have to do today, let's take supply chain alone. That's the biggest item on the news front today. Supply chain can be held up for weeks, months, and in that case, it results in many companies having to buy materials and provide for their production capabilities for months' worth of inventory, which has a massive impact on their cash flow. Very, very critical to the overall well-being and operational capability of a business. And same thing with inflationary expenses. How much is now being charged for gas? How much is being charged for transportation? Do you have a price for a product that is inclusive or exclusive of freight to the customer? Does that ultimately leave you with a cost that makes that product now just marginally contribution capable, or is it still that you still have a profitability out of that, or is it underwater? And should you be considering holding out on that product or discontinuing it for the fact that it's now eating into your profitability or the numbers? The bottom line is that you need to be able to trust your data and make decisions based on facts, not fiction. Facts are the foot soldiers in the army of persuasion, which I've said before. And that at the end of the day, you also have meaning, variance, and analysis at the reporting time, because otherwise it's just a lot of numbers with no benefit to the company at all. So, what a successful budget actually is. Let's have a look at some of the important characteristics. So first of all, it must not just be a financial exercise. It's absolutely imperative that it shouldn't be just that, because you have to have the input from everyone, inclusive of the operational folks, the HR people, the sales people. All of these individuals on the operating side bring value that actually drives the detail behind the budget. It's not a financial exercise in and of itself at all. The other thing is that you need to have the input from the executives. Where do they want to go? We'll deal with that shortly. But it also needs to be well planned. You've got to have buy-in and input at all levels, just as we explained. If it's not well planned, if it's not defined as to who's going to participate, what they're going to be participating in, what information they're going to be valued to bring, then they're not going to have an interest in the budget, and you can bet your bottom dollar it will be used as an excuse. A budget also needs to have clearly defined goals. In other words, a good start time, a good completion time, and an accurate set of details that have to be evaluated and approved or recommended in order for the budget to be accepted. I've stated this before, and I will not stop reiterating this particular point. It needs to be accurate. A budget that is inaccurate is nothing more than a number crunching exercise that becomes absolutely meaningless and is of no guidelines to anybody, inclusive and very specifically to the executives. This is like taking a vacation and just turning out your driveway and finding a direction and a distance which you know not, and just going somewhere in the hope that something will happen. Well, you cannot do that in business. It's a absolute perfect recipe for failure. Budgets need to also be flexible and interactive. As I said before, flexible in that it does need to be able to be changed and adapted according to the circumstances as it changes. So forecasting is the one driver that will come into play there. And it needs to be interactive. How does your budget for forecasting of sales project into production and into the labor and into the materials? Because if these numbers are not interactive, you could have somebody that is an over-exuberant budgeter of revenue, only to find that if that number goes and is pushed further down the line, what could happen, production goes out, they buy too many materials and or equipment and or people, only to find that the actual projection has fallen flat. So again, it must be realistic and attainable, and also for that, the reason it's got to be there so that you can energize and invigorate your salespeople to be excited about the attainability and that they can achieve their objective and get their commissions. After all, most companies have that kind of a plan where salespeople are compensated on achievement. It must also be clearly communicated across the board to everybody. This is a budget. And I want to just highlight a specific point here. A budget, as it pertains to revenue, is critically important, but it is just as important as the rest of the budget, which includes costs and cost containment. Because you have budgeted for an expense doesn't mean that somebody must go out and spend. I've heard this statement before. I've heard that then we won't get it for the next year, or we won't get this. That is not budgeting. That is shooting in the dark, and it is absolutely a big no-no for a company in order to be able to create the best possible profitability. So what are some of the biggest budgeting mistakes? Things not to do. Having only one person or group as a budget owner or developer. Having too many manual processes and disparate spreadsheets. In other words, the siloed budgeting effect. You know, we live in a world where everybody, 90% of companies still use spreadsheets to be able to create budgeting. Many of those are not created with an integrated solution. And when it is, it's just very complicated. You have macros one pulling information from the other, and these things change. Everything changes. Information moves along, and you cannot necessarily do that very easily. But all too often we have disparate spreadsheets. One does not drive the other, and they get put together in a siloed fashion, which makes the budget somewhat, again, meaningless. Now, here's a very important part. Not having the involvement from the executive level through management leaves you with no defined strategy, plan, or goals. In other words, you don't know where the company's going. How do I get to the point of understanding what is going to satisfy the executives for this budget, because they have a reporting mechanism to the boards of directors, to the shareholders, etc. So there has to be a level of understanding as to where they would like to take the company. Otherwise, their existence is short-lived. We need to make sure that we don't have misleading assumptions or overstating of projections. So we spoke about this before, an over-exuberance on growth. Now, it's all very well, and I've experienced this myself, where I've seen a company looking to grow their business 5, 6, 7 times the previous year's numbers, but it was absolutely impossible. So they built up on a sales profile that could certainly do that, but the capacity constraints to be able to do that and meet those overexuberance in growth numbers were just absolutely impossible. One, from the fact that it would have taken way too much capital to be able to achieve that growth, and secondarily, there was absolutely no ways that there were enough people in the marketplace to be able to support that same type of growth. Now, playing the guessing game is yet another one where many people will say, well, just take the same as last year, add 10%. That's just fictitious numbers. There's got to be some detail behind it, some thought process. It's not just an exercise to fill in numbers. So that's critical. Don't just play the guessing game, because it again provides with at least one or several lines of meaningless numbers which you have no reason to look forward to or work on or bank on. Now, the other thing is that quite often companies will look at generating an annual number and saying, well, here's it, it's just the same budget every month. Well, that means that there's zero thought to any seasonal trends and to the financial impact on cash. We all know that some things happen at different times in the business, whatever it is. There's some expenses that happen from time to time. They cannot just be spread, and it puts a burden on the financial team to be able to accrue for those numbers accurately unless it is done with some level of seasonality. And the impact on cash is big. We've spoken a little bit about the lack of production capabilities, but this could lead to major capacity constraints and ultimately could be dissatisfied customers who may choose to leave, so you have a lack of loyalty. When a budget lacks clear logic and process, it becomes meaningless. We've spoken about the communication, the overall buy-in is not achieved, and assuming the existence of revenue as an indicative of positive cash flow is absolutely a challenge as well, especially in the world of supply chain challenge that we have today, where you've had to be able to extend your cash, look at how that's got to be dealt with. You've got materials that have to be bought, and so when you've got the outflow of a lot of cash and you're just looking at the revenue situation on any given period of time, that's not positive cash. And assuming cash in the bank, as I've seen small to medium-sized companies saying it's profitable, that too is not true. So let's start with the idea of what do we need to do right from the get-go as it relates to forecasting. Let's start with the eyes focused and aligned on the executive's strategic objectives and goals for the corporation. It becomes incumbent on the executives to state where they'd like to be. I'd like to make sure that, as an example, I'd like to make sure that my growth percentage is 5, 10, 15, 20%. Now, is that achievable in each and every case? We know that that will have to be evaluated and refined in the operational side. But it is an objective. It is a goal. It is and should be an achievable goal. Likewise with profitability or EBITDA or materials or cost of goods numbers. All of these are critical for the executives to set it up as objectives in order to get to a set of numbers that they feel comfortable with presenting to the shareholders and or financial institutions, or just, for the purpose of the positive growth and recognition that the business is doing well. So we need to set accurate and achievable revenue goals that will drive the incentive and the acceptable achievement. Sales targets which are reachable. Commissions will be earned and the sales teams is incentivized. Accurate projections lead to informed decision making regarding capital investments into materials and equipment. One of the companies I spent some time with also had stretched the objectives of the revenue to such an extent that when looked upon by the now decision makers to make this happen within the company, they went and spent their money up front to buy the equipment that was necessary to meet those goals. They purchased materials, they bought all this equipment, and guess what? 6 months into it, all of that had to be changed and revised down. So there's money that's just been wasted and lying in a state that it's unusable. Accurate projections help to define also the human capital requirements and therefore more contained expenses, because just like the example before, if you're going to have this massive growth, there's a recruitment exercise that has to take place months before this happens, and so you might have a bunch of people that then end up sitting around idle. And that's not just the case, but if you don't have the correct projections, you may not be able to find the people when you need them, in which case you now have yourself stymied and you cannot meet the objectives that you have in the first place. So a lot of functionality that comes into the accuracy and a lot of the impact that is both positive and negative. Let's have a look at some of the other issues on forecasting. The impact of external drivers, both marketing and political. Number one, a very good part of this budgeting exercise is look at the market size and determine what is the addressable spend within the market. In other words, what is possible to be addressed by the overall industry so that you could determine whether or not you actually have a shot at a bigger piece of the pie or not, because there is another portion of this which we'll have a look at, which again, how much do you have? What is your competitive market? What is the addressable or the market that you're addressing right now? But you do need to understand how big is that market, because one other thing that we want to talk about is as you look at products, each product has a life cycle. Do you introduce new products, and can you, with introduction of new products, meet and grow that market that is addressable, or have you reached a peak? In looking at that, what are some of the market changes? Are there definitive changes in the market that's moving away from the product that you now provide to the product that many people are going towards right now? Technology is changing. The iPhone is a great example. It only lasts for a while, and then you've got a new product. It's got to be the new thing that gets people out there to buy. So look at that particular product, and then also, how does that compare with the competitors that you have? And that brings me to the third point, which is you have to know your competitors' market share and you have to know their pricing strategies. What are they bringing to the market? What products do they have that are competing with yours? What is their size of their market and what makes them successful? And what are their pricing strategies? There's a company that I was involved with. We had a tremendous challenge with pricing strategies because companies were going out there to buy the market. Now, we know that we live in a global economy, and one of the interesting things I can tell you from having lived through it is that in the packaging and plastics industry, the market was being bought by countries like China because they had a very low entry level into the market, which everybody went for just to buy it. Now, that didn't necessarily mean that it met all the criteria, let's say from an FDA perspective, but it certainly created a problem, and we needed to be able to compete, not just in a price perspective, but what did we have to do to compete quality-wise so that we could retain our market share. What is the impact of the changing demographics on the marketplace? The newer generation that's coming in, are they looking at the same products? Are they looking at different ones? How's that changing? How do you need to adapt? Are your products still in line with that growth? Then we've got to look at the impact of political changes and regulations. What are some of those? We'll have a look at them shortly. But amongst other things would be things like inflation, tax increases, medical contributions. Then we have the supply chain impact on customers' product demand. And then we have social and economic changes that have an impact on the business. Now, when we look at some of the internal drivers, we spoke about the external, but let's have a look at the internal. What is the market that you have? What is your market share, and how do you support that, and where can you grow within the market that you have? So in other words, when you're looking at the overall addressable market, it might be in a specific product range or industry, but you might be only catering to a very small share of that. And within that share, can you, or are you supporting that well enough? Can you grow within that, or do you need to provide additional products to be able to get into the bigger echelon of production into a different area within that, that industry? You need to know your customer. That's an important part. Need to know your customer and the market penetration. How well are you selling to your customer or into that market? What is that penetration that you have? So where you know what your market share and what you're selling and competing into, and also with your customers, are you getting some penetration? In other words, let's use a simple example. A customer that spends $10 million a month on a specific product that you provide, how much of that are you getting, and how well have you penetrated that buy that they have themselves? But then you also need to understand their buying trends and their strategies. What's actually going on in their business? How are they applying themselves for the next year or the seasonal trends that there may be? And what are their strategies? Are they going to grow? Are they going to use more of your product? Are they going to reduce your product? Do they need a change in product? Are you going from one to the other? What are going to be some of the challenges there? Very importantly is also customer retention and loyalty. I've heard companies where they said, well, you know, the loss of customers is just something that we have to expect. That's nonsense. It's not true. Customer retention, customers are very difficult to get in the first place. So retention is important, and their loyalty to you is also of great importance because it helps you to be able to define how much you may rely on them for the purpose of getting more and more sales. But retention is an important thing so that you can at least rely on the revenue that they may bring, especially if you have that recurring revenue model. We've spoken a bit about the understanding of the impact on the demographics on the marketplace. In other words, how are the younger people generation making those changes? So if you are, whether you be in a restaurant and providing certain kinds of foods, sort of older type meals versus newer type menus, to retail, the kind of clothing, to the products that we serve, that we produce, telephones, computers, laptops, etc. What is needed to be able to generate that, and how is that going to have an impact on your business? What are the competitive market? Alternative products. Alternative products are some things that we very seldom take into consideration because there's often cases when we open our eyes and the competitors come up with an alternative product, you next look at your business and it's gone. And again, we've spoken about seasonality and trends, product life cycle, supply chain, and very specifically inventory levels for safety stock. These are very critical to look at because today we're having to invest in a lot more inventory to be able to move along. Now, we've spoken about some political factors, but I just want to highlight them one more time. We've got increased taxes. Increased taxes, as you know, are going to be passed on whether you're a manufacturer, producer, or you buying from somewhere else, raw materials. We know that we all are being driven to increase the minimum wages, and that has an impact. That has an impact on your overall cost. Do you have to participate in new medical plans, and what is the impact of that on your business if you are forced to do so? What is the impact of increases in tariffs or the decreases in tariffs? How's that going to impact you? Are you able to now compete, bring back a product that you may have held as dormant? And two very big ones, inflation and the social and economic changes that come into play. So let's have a look at some more aspects of what makes budgeting good. So we've known that in many instances, from a budgeting perspective, everybody says, well, let's increase the revenue. Increasing the revenue goes without saying, but it is not the alpha and omega of budgeting. We need to understand the capacity constraints so that at some point in time, we know what we can produce, how well we can produce, and that we don't overburden the operations with just this increased capacity. But what it can tell us is if we've got accuracy, we can be clear of mind as to whether or not we can not only support that market growth, but how do we do it, and is it done by additional capital investment in equipment, or do we outsource some of that to be able to support the growth in the policy that we have and the capabilities that we have. We need to understand that relative to growth, to understand the human capital requirements, are employees available? We know that today that is not quite possible. Employees are very difficult to come by, and when they are, it's at quite a price, and that needs to be brought into consideration. The one that very seldom seems to be forgotten is that of the improved utilization and efficiency. You know, the MES systems, manufacturing execution systems, are out there, and it's critical to understand how well are you utilizing your equipment. And it's vital because that costs money. It certainly is manned, and so that's extra cash. But how well are you utilizing those machines? Let's look at a very simple example where you have bought a piece of new equipment. Let's take the printing industry as an example. You bought this piece of equipment that has much more in their capability and added value. Well, are you utilizing that? Are you capitalizing on all its capabilities and utilizing the machine for the full extent of not only what it can do, but for the full set of hours that you have manufacturing capability? In other words, let's say you got 1 8-hour shift, knowing full well that you have certain times for lunch. Those are obligatory, as well as your tea breaks or coffee breaks. How much of that is then taken away from the hours that you have to be able to run those machines? Or can you run them through those times by alternating and having skeleton staff running and managing the machines while they're in process? In other words, if you want to be able to run 8 hours, you're going to get 2 hours, maybe more than if you took an hour and a half an hour each for, morning and afternoon coffee break. That's 2 hours, gives you 75% of your overall production capability, and you've just increased, if you change that, you've increased your utilization to maybe that 100% versus 80% or 75%. The other is efficiencies. Within the capability of that machine, are your operators well enough trained to be able to provide you with a level of production that you bank in on from your standards? In other words, when you look at a brand new machine and the manufacturer tells you can produce X number of units per hour, are those standards being met? What are your standards? Are you efficient, and are the operators efficiently trained to provide you with that level of efficiency that would make that acceptable? If not, those are the numbers that will impact your cost and reduce your profitability, and keeping those numbers in check will actually help you not only to be budgeting better, but to be able to maintain the kind of profitability that you're looking at to go forward. Now this is a big question for everybody out there is there a clear understanding as to what products that you are producing, how many of them generate a contribution, and how many of those products just seize too much production time? So let's look at what that means. Every product in your makeup should be making a contribution margin. In other words, their sales minus their variable costs should be making a contribution to the bottom line. But if those products that you're making also take up too much of your factory time, is that worth it? Is it valuable? These are the questions that go to a CFO that you provide as input that a corporation can then make use of to determine whether or not products are valuable, invaluable, and if it's taken up too much time, should they be phased out and brought in with something that is a little bit easier, quicker, and more profitable to make. Also know what are the biggest contributors to your cost base. In other words, let's take something that I was very familiar with, consumables. Sometimes the consumables might be very expensive. I've seen cases where consumables were just spent. Just recently did a podcast where we spoke about some of these things. But two examples that I can cite where consumables, being ink that was used in the printing industry, ink buckets were being emptied out because people needed to use the ink buckets for carrying vessels for other things. And so the usage of ink went through the roof. It was a massive problem, notwithstanding the fact that where it was being dumped created an economic, environmental issue for the company. Another incident was my own company, where people were taking consumables and using them for their own spare time because they had things like diamond blades and diamond pads, and it was very valuable. But cutting those numbers down and managing them to what would be according to my production requirements, in that instance, I was able to reduce my consumable usage so that my cost per unit dropped dramatically. Let's say from $25 per unit down to less than $5. So big difference that could be taken in managing some of those costs, controlling them. Need to have a clear understanding of the purchasing requirements. What are your economic order quantities, your lead times, minimum, maximum order quantities? Because again, in our supply chain challenges that we have today, these are the things that will impact your cash flow. Also, understand, are there alternatives and more competitive suppliers that you might want to consider in this economic climate? That, again, supply chain and inflation might be able to be impacted with a competitive supplier. And clearly know the production materials and yield correlations. Here's a very interesting example. If you're doing accurate budgeting and accurate sets of numbers, again, from an example in the packaging industry, in my background, through the understanding of what my yield correlations would be relative to production and material usage, we were able to determine that material usage was going through the roof in one instance, because the engineering tools were not being engineered correctly, and we're paying extraordinary amount of money for the refurbishment of those materials, as well as some materials were going out the back door and being sold off the back of the truck. And those were big impacts on our financials at the end of the month. Those were found and stopped. So it is important, and that allows you to be able to find some of those things. Just want to show you some interesting parts of the budgeting process. If you have a look at some of the points that came out of the magazines and the CFO type evaluated, or the CFO magazines that evaluated some of these concepts. A recent survey revealed that CFOs worry that businesses are losing the benefits of cost reduction programs. In other words, how do I reduce my costs? Because whilst you cannot reduce costs to profitability, you certainly can cut costs to allow for a better margin. There's no doubt. And a lot of people think, a lot of CEOs overestimate their company's effectiveness of reallocating resources in a way that drives the organization's value. 70% of CEOs say that return on investment cost savings is formally evaluated by management, yet only 49% of CFOs agree with that philosophy. If you have a look at this graphical representation here, look at the confidence between the CFOs and the CEOs as it relates to value creation. In the first graph, 51% believe in that valuation versus 34%. Skeptical of alignment to growth, 31% of the customers of CEOs believe that there is an alignment, whereas only 17% of CFOs believe it's true. What does that tell you? That in the world in which we live in today, and so often in companies, there is very little visibility, very little communication, and very little cohesive kind of look into the business that makes sense from all and sundry. A very critical and important part of where we're going. So I know that it's true that the CFO is closer than the CEO to the process of budgeting and the strategy and the annual planning, and that this data orientation that CFOs bring to the table is not always fully valued because people look to more visionary type of behavior because everybody wants to be bigger and grow much faster and do what needs to be done. But the importance behind this is that with this, as it's known, the gravity of tension, if that continues to increase, it's very, very dangerous because the consequences are that the parties are separated. So just a few takeaway tips before we close this out. Ensure that your budgeting is as granular and as accurate as possible. Again, I repeat, facts are the foot soldiers in the army of persuasion. When you've got that, you cannot have people disagree with you. It's got to be something that drives it. Speed and efficiency are critical so that results can be analyzed and reviewed from the perspective of whether or not they're real and re-identified if they're not and re-looked at. It's critical to compare the final refined results with the corporate strategy to see how they match up. If the executives are expecting 20%, and as you refine these budgets, and you will see the process that we have defined for that in our solution, if you have big differences, at least it tells you what those differences are, and you can go and have a look to see where they come from and why. And it well might be that the managers on the operating side of the business and in the field have a much clearer understanding than the executives may be stretching that target to 20%. Those are negotiated numbers, and they make sense when they are compared, refined, and re-identified. Maintain flexibility in your budgeting exercise. Because it needs to be an integrated solution, which is what we will provide you with, there is absolutely, and there's no doubt that in the 40 plus years of my doing this kind of business in finance and working in manufacturing, the numbers that come in on so many different fronts, whether it be from sales, where it normally will change, all the way to production, where operating managers and chief operating officers will look at their business and say, I need to make a change here, I need to add more people, I need to reduce more people, I'm going to bring in something else as a piece of equipment, or I can increase my capacity. Those numbers will change, so you need to have flexibility, and it cannot be done with doing budgeting in a siloed Excel kind of a base. It's too much of an exercise, and so quite often those are forgotten. We look to be able to create that for you so that that flexibility is maintained all the way through. You need to regularly review and analyze the variances, because those are the factors that will help you define the direction that the corporation needs to take in order to achieve the goals. But there's got to be a guideline that you can manage according to, and you can evaluate with some certainty. And keep an objective eye on the changing market and forecast regularly. Without that, your business is going to fall behind. You're not going to be aware of the changing markets. You're not going to be aware of how business is interacting. And the greatest example of that would be the last year, 2020, when the pandemic hit. The markets just collapsed. We came back in 2021, markets just boomed again. And if you don't have an eye on how that market is changing, you will either lose out because you are overburdened with costs, or you're going to lose out because you cannot meet the demand. With that, we're going to call this presentation to an end, and I want to thank you for listening and wish you all a better budgeting exercise going forward. Thank you very much.